They believed the document had disappeared forever, but they had no idea that the smallest gap in the archive was about to expose the biggest mistake in the company's history. The 42nd floor of Reed Capital buzzed with excitement as executives prepared for what many called the most important acquisition the company had ever attempted. Conference rooms were full, legal teams worked late into the evening, and financial analysts moved through the hallways carrying thick binders filled with projections and approvals. Everyone seemed focused on the future. Everyone except Emily Carter. At 43 years old, Emily worked in the records and archive department, a quiet corner of the company that most executives barely remembered existed. Her office sat near the lower floors beside rows of filing cabinets, storage shelves, and decades of corporate records. It was not glamorous work. It did not attract attention. Yet Emily took pride in it because she believed every document told part of a story. On a rainy Tuesday morning, she began a routine verification process requested by the legal department. Her task was simple. She needed to confirm that all historical acquisition files connected to the upcoming deal had been properly archived and digitized. It was the kind of assignment most employees would complete without a second thought. Emily approached it differently. She checked every record one by one. The soft hum of fluorescent lights filled the room as she compared digital inventories against physical storage logs. Hours passed. Outside, rain tapped against narrow windows. Inside, Emily continued reviewing file numbers, dates, and archive locations. Then something unusual caught her attention. She paused. A single reference number appeared in an inventory report, but the corresponding document was missing. At first, she assumed it was a routine clerical error. Missing records occasionally happened. Files were moved, scanned, or reclassified. Yet when she searched the digital database, the result was the same. The document did not appear anywhere. Emily leaned closer to her monitor. Her eyes moved across the screen again. The reference number remained there, attached to an acquisition completed nearly 15 years earlier. Stranger still, the inventory system clearly showed that the document had existed at one time. There was a location code. There was a tracking entry. There was even a record indicating that multiple executives had reviewed it years ago. But the document itself was gone. Emily frowned. She opened additional records and began tracing the history of the file. Every trail ended in the same place. The document should have been there. Simply was not. Upstairs, executives celebrated another successful milestone in the acquisition process. Laughter echoed through glass conference rooms. Plans moved forward. Nobody knew that deep inside the archive system, a single missing document had just raised a question no one else had noticed. Emily stared at the empty space on her screen. Something about it felt wrong. Not because a file was missing, but because the absence seemed deliberate. She could not explain why. She only knew that the more she looked, the less sense it made. Around her, the archive room remained silent. Rows of cabinets stretched into the distance beneath white lights. For most people, it would have looked ordinary. To Emily, it suddenly felt like the beginning of a mystery. Most people would have forgotten about the missing file by the end of the day. Emily Carter could not. Long after the rain stopped outside the building, the empty record continued to occupy her thoughts. The reference number remained visible in the archive database like a missing piece in a puzzle that nobody else realized was incomplete. The following morning, she arrived earlier than usual and returned directly to the record system. The legal verification project was still underway, and dozens of files remained to be reviewed, yet Emily found herself returning to the same acquisition record again and again. The more she examined it, the stranger it became. The missing document was not some minor internal memo or routine correspondence. According to the tracking logs, it had been reviewed by multiple senior executives during a major acquisition completed 15 years earlier. Even more unusual, the document carried a classification level typically reserved for material considered critical to corporate transactions. Emily opened additional archive histories and compared them with surrounding records from the same period. Every related file appeared exactly where it should. Legal opinions were present. Financial disclosures were present. Executive summaries were present. Only one item was missing: She quietly printed several tracking reports and spread them across her desk. The patterns began to form. Each record confirmed that the document had existed. Each record confirmed it had been accessed. Yet none explained where it had gone. Around mid-morning, Emily carried her findings to a supervisor named Daniel Mercer. Daniel managed archive operations and had spent years treating records management as a routine administrative function. He listened for less than a minute before dismissing the concern. If it disappeared 15 years ago, it obviously was not important enough for anyone to miss, he said while continuing to review emails. Emily calmly explained that the document appeared connected to the company's largest acquisition currently under review. Daniel barely looked up. "You are spending too much time on a missing file," he replied. "Focus on completing the verification project." The conversation ended there. Emily returned to her desk feeling embarrassed but unconvinced. Something still felt wrong. During lunch, she continued examining the records alone. Most employees filled the cafeteria discussing promotions, bonuses, and the upcoming acquisition announcement. Emily sat quietly with a stack of archive reports. Then she noticed another detail. A storage location code attached to the missing document no longer existed in the current archive system. Her eyes narrowed. Old storage codes were usually converted when records were migrated into new databases. This one had not been. It was as though the document belonged to a section of the archive that had vanished from the map entirely. A chill of curiosity moved through her. Suddenly the problem was no longer about a missing file. It was about a missing trail. Late that afternoon, Emily opened historical storage blueprints that had not been referenced in years. Dust-covered digital records appeared on her screen. Rows of retired archive sections stretched across diagrams from another era of the company. Then she found it. The location code. It pointed to an archive section that no longer appeared on any modern inventory list. Emily stared at the screen in silence. Everyone else believed the file had simply disappeared. For the first time, she began to suspect that it had been hidden. They laughed at the question because they assumed the answer could not possibly matter. Emily Carter would soon discover how dangerous that assumption could be. The old storage code remained open on her screen as evening settled over the city. Most employees had already stopped thinking about the missing document. Daniel Mercer certainly had. Yet the more Emily studied the retired archive maps, the more convinced she became that the file had not simply vanished through negligence. It had disappeared through a process no one bothered to understand. The next morning, she arrived carrying a notebook filled with handwritten observations. She spent hours comparing historical archive layouts with modern storage inventories. Entire sections of the company's record system had been reorganized over the years. Rooms had been renamed. Shelves had been relocated. Databases had been migrated. Yet one specific archive section seemed different. It appeared on older blueprints, then gradually disappeared from later versions without any explanation. Emily gathered copies of the diagrams and requested access to several legacy storage reports. The request attracted attention. By lunchtime, Daniel called her into his office. His expression suggested annoyance rather than curiosity. He closed the door and looked at the papers in her hands. "You are still chasing that missing file?" he asked. Emily calmly explained what she had found. She showed him the obsolete storage code, the missing archive section, and the inconsistent inventory history. Daniel barely glanced at the documents. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Emily, this company has thousands of records. Some get lost. Some get moved. Some get destroyed under retention policies. You are wasting time on something nobody cares about." She tried to explain that the document appeared connected to a major acquisition. Daniel interrupted before she could finish. "The legal department has teams of attorneys. The executive floor has consultants making six-figure salaries. If this file mattered, someone more important than us would have noticed by now." The words stung more than she expected. Not because they were cruel, but because they reflected exactly how most people viewed her position. Emily was an archive clerk. She organized records. She was not expected to solve problems. She was expected to store paperwork and stay out of the way. The meeting ended quickly. As she walked back through the corridor, she noticed several coworkers exchanging curious glances. News traveled fast in office buildings. Some employees already knew she was searching for a file nobody else seemed interested in finding. One employee smiled politely and asked whether she was hunting treasure. Another joked that maybe the document never existed at all. Emily responded with a quiet smile and returned to her desk. She did not argue. She did not defend herself. Instead, she reviewed the evidence again. The tracking records remained unchanged. The storage code remained real. The missing archive section remained unexplained. Facts were stubborn things. Late that afternoon, while examining another retired inventory report, she noticed a reference she had missed before. A transfer authorization dated 14 years earlier. The document contained only a brief note, but it referenced the same storage section she had been investigating. Emily leaned forward and read the line again. Her heartbeat quickened. For the first time, she had found proof that someone intentionally moved materials out of the forgotten archive area. And if records had been moved, then somewhere inside Reed Capital a trail still existed. The trail had survived for 14 years. It only needed someone patient enough to follow it. Emily Carter stared at the transfer authorization while the office around her gradually emptied for the evening. Most employees were heading home. The lights in nearby departments were shutting off one by one. Yet Emily remained seated, studying a single line buried inside an aging archive report. The authorization referenced the forgotten storage section she had been investigating and confirmed that materials had been relocated shortly before a major corporate restructuring. For the first time, she had evidence that the missing document did not simply disappear. Someone had deliberately moved records connected to that archive area. The question was where they went. The following morning, Emily returned with renewed determination. She began tracing every transfer authorization connected to the obsolete storage section. Most records led nowhere. Some referenced locations that no longer existed. Others contained incomplete information left behind during system migrations. Still, a pattern slowly emerged. Multiple transfers appeared connected to a facility beneath the company's original headquarters building. A section of the archive network retired more than a decade earlier. Emily pulled up historical property maps and discovered something surprising. Beneath the current storage infrastructure sat an older archive room that no longer appeared on modern floor plans. The room had once housed sensitive legal and acquisition records before being sealed during renovations years earlier. Emily felt her pulse quicken. She printed the maps and compared them with maintenance records. The room was real. More importantly, no documentation clearly stated what happened to every file stored there. During lunch, she visited the facilities department and politely asked about the retired archive area. Most employees had never heard of it. One maintenance supervisor vaguely remembered stories about old storage rooms beneath the building but admitted he had never entered them himself. "Those spaces were closed off years ago," he said. "Nobody uses them anymore." Emily thanked him and returned to her desk. By late afternoon, she had assembled a timeline connecting the missing document to the forgotten archive section and the sealed storage room beneath the original headquarters. The evidence remained circumstantial, but the connections were becoming difficult to ignore. She considered reporting her findings again. Then she remembered Daniel Mercer's reaction. The thought faded quickly. Facts would convince people eventually. Opinions would not. As evening settled over Chicago, Emily reviewed one final maintenance log. Hidden among routine renovation records was a reference to a restricted access inventory completed shortly before the archive room had been closed. The inventory listed dozens of storage containers transferred into the area. One container number immediately caught her attention. It matched a sequence appearing in the historical records connected to the missing file. Emily froze. For several seconds, she simply stared at the screen. The room around her felt completely silent. The trail that began with a missing reference number had now led to a physical location. A real room, a real inventory, a real container. Outside her window, city lights began appearing across the skyline. Inside the archive department, Emily carefully organized every note she had collected. Tomorrow she would request access to the retired storage area. She had no idea what she would find. She only knew one thing with certainty. The mystery was no longer hiding inside a computer system. It was waiting somewhere beneath the building. The room had been forgotten by almost everyone. That was precisely why the truth survived there. Emily Carter arrived at the facility's office shortly after sunrise carrying copies of the archive maps, transfer authorizations, and inventory reports she had spent days assembling. She requested temporary access to the retired storage area beneath the original headquarters building. The employee handling the request looked surprised. Few people ever asked about the sealed archive section. After reviewing several old maintenance records and obtaining managerial approval, he finally handed her a temporary access card. "You will probably find nothing down there," he said with a polite smile. Emily thanked him and headed toward the lower levels of the building. The elevator descended below the public floors and stopped near a maintenance corridor few employees ever visited. The atmosphere felt different immediately. The polished corporate environment above gave way to concrete walls, utility lighting, and quiet hallways lined with locked doors. Emily followed the old floor plans she had printed and eventually reached a narrow corridor ending at a metal security door. A faded identification plate still displayed the archive section code she had discovered in the records. For a moment, she simply stared at it. The code was real. The room was real. Everything she had uncovered was leading exactly where the evidence suggested. She used the access card and slowly entered the archive area. Dust-covered and used shelving units stretching across the room. Rows of storage containers sat beneath fluorescent lights that flickered softly overhead. The space felt frozen in time. Emily moved carefully through the aisles while comparing container numbers against her notes. Some boxes held old legal correspondence. Others contained retired financial reports and project records. Hour after hour passed. The deeper she searched, the more she understood why nobody had found the missing document. The archive section contained thousands of records accumulated over decades. Finding one specific file seemed nearly impossible. Yet Emily kept following the trail. Every clue narrowed the search. Every inventory report eliminated another possibility. Then, late in the afternoon, she reached a shelf near the back of the room. A storage container rested there beneath a thin layer of dust. The identification number matched the sequence referenced in the transfer authorization. Emily froze. Her heart began beating faster. Slowly, she lifted the container onto a nearby table. Inside sat dozens of folders arranged by year and transaction number. She carefully reviewed them one by one. Minutes passed. Then she saw it. The reference number that had started everything. The missing file. For several seconds, Emily simply stared at the folder. The document everyone overlooked. The document nobody thought mattered. The document hidden inside a forgotten archive room for more than 14 years. She opened the folder and began reading. The first pages appeared routine. Then she reached a signed legal memorandum attached near the back. Her expression changed immediately. The memorandum directly addressed assumptions connected to the acquisition currently under review by Reed Capital. Emily read the page again, then again. The implications became impossible to ignore. The missing document contained information that contradicted a key foundation of the billion-dollar transaction executives were preparing to approve. A hush seemed to fill the room around her. The mystery was over. The real problem was only beginning. Emily carefully closed the folder and looked across the silent archive. For years, the truth had waited inside a forgotten box beneath the building. Now it had finally been found. The document had survived 14 years in silence. Within a single afternoon, it threatened to change everything. Emily Carter carried the folder back to her office with extraordinary care. The bustling activity of the company seemed distant as she walked through hallways filled with employees discussing the upcoming acquisition. Nobody paid attention to the archive clerk carrying an old legal memorandum beneath her arm. Nobody realized she was holding information capable of stopping the largest transaction in Reed Capital's history. Once inside her office, Emily closed the door and read the document again from beginning to end. The language was precise, formal, and impossible to misunderstand. 14 years earlier, outside legal counsel had identified a critical limitation connected to assets now being used as a foundation for the current acquisition strategy. The memorandum clearly warned that future valuations relying on certain assumptions could produce misleading conclusions if specific conditions were ignored. Emily compared the memorandum to current acquisition materials. Her concern deepened immediately. The exact assumptions mentioned in the forgotten document appeared throughout modern reports and executive presentations. She checked again to ensure she was not misunderstanding the language. The result remained the same. The missing document directly contradicted one of the central arguments supporting the billion-dollar deal. A chill moved through her. This was no longer an archive issue. It was a corporate risk issue. Emily organized every piece of evidence she had collected since discovering the missing file. She assembled the inventory records, transfer authorizations, storage maps, and archive histories into a clear timeline. Then she attached copies of the recovered memorandum. The final package was concise but powerful. It documented not only what she found but how she found it. By late afternoon, she knew the information had to reach someone capable of acting on it. She considered sending it through ordinary reporting channels, but memories of Daniel Mercer's dismissive reaction quickly returned. The acquisition was moving rapidly toward final approval. Delays could matter. Hesitation could matter. Facts mattered most. Emily submitted the report directly to the corporate compliance office responsible for reviewing material risks. After pressing the final button, she sat quietly and stared at her screen. The task that began with a missing reference number was now out of her hands. Upstairs, executives continued preparing for approval meetings scheduled later in the week. Financial forecasts circulated through conference rooms. Legal teams reviewed final agreements. Confidence remained high. Yet shortly before evening, a compliance manager opened Emily's report and began reading. What started as routine review quickly became something else. The manager requested supporting documentation, then additional records, then legal verification. Within hours, multiple departments were examining the recovered memorandum. The atmosphere inside the compliance office changed noticeably. Questions began appearing. Phone calls followed. By nightfall, a summary of the findings was prepared for senior leadership. One name appeared at the top of the distribution list. Jonathan Reed, Billionaire founder, chief executive, the man expected to approve the acquisition. As city lights illuminated the Chicago skyline, a sealed envelope containing Emily's report was delivered to the executive floor. The archive clerk had done her job. The evidence was complete. The truth was documented. Now the decision belonged to someone else. And somewhere above her in the tower, a billionaire was about to read a document that had been missing for 14 years. The document had already survived 14 years. The question now was whether anyone would have the courage to act on what it revealed. Jonathan Reed arrived at his office before sunrise, expecting another day filled with acquisition briefings and executive meetings. The transaction scheduled for approval later that week represented years of planning and negotiation. Analysts praised it. Consultants endorsed it. Investors anticipated it. Everything appeared ready to move forward. Then a compliance officer placed a sealed report on his desk. The cover page contained a name Jonathan did not recognize. Emily Carter, Archive Records Department. Jonathan almost set the report aside. Almost. Something about the accompanying note caught his attention. It stated that recently recovered historical documentation might materially affect assumptions supporting the acquisition. The wording was cautious but serious. Jonathan opened the report and began reading. Minutes passed. Then more minutes. His attention narrowed completely onto the pages before him. Emily's report was remarkably straightforward. There were no dramatic claims, no accusations, no speculation, only evidence. The timeline documented the missing file, the transfer records, the retired archive section, the recovery process. Most importantly, it included the legal memorandum itself. Jonathan reached the memorandum and carefully read every page. His expression slowly changed. The document directly challenged one of the transaction's core assumptions. More troubling, the warning had existed for years. It had simply disappeared from active review after the file vanished into the forgotten archive system. Jonathan leaned back in his chair and stared across the city skyline beyond the glass walls. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he returned to the first page and read the entire report again. The room remained completely silent except for the distant hum of the building. The deeper he looked, the more difficult it became to dismiss the findings. Every supporting document aligned. Every record supported the same conclusion. A forgotten legal memorandum was now raising questions capable of altering a billion-dollar decision. Jonathan pressed a button on his desk and instructed his assistant to postpone the morning meeting schedule. Within an hour, senior compliance officers, legal counsel, and acquisition specialists gathered inside a private conference room. Copies of Emily's report rested before each attendee. Jonathan watched quietly as they reviewed the evidence. At first, several executives appeared skeptical. Then they reached the memorandum. The atmosphere changed immediately. Questions replaced confidence. Discussions became more cautious. Several participants requested additional verification. Others reviewed historical files in silence. One legal advisor eventually looked up from the documents and delivered a simple conclusion. The memorandum could not be ignored. A hush settled across the room. Jonathan stood near the window overlooking downtown Chicago. The acquisition had been treated as a certainty. Now uncertainty had entered the room. Not because of market conditions. Not because of competitors. Because an archive clerk discovered a document everyone else failed to find. Jonathan looked down at the report one final time. Emily Carter. A woman working quietly among filing cabinets and storage records. Someone most executives had likely passed in hallways without noticing. Yet her persistence had accomplished something an entire network of advisors, analysts, and attorneys had not. She had found the missing piece. Late that afternoon, Jonathan issued a directive halting final approval procedures pending immediate review. The announcement spread through the executive floor within minutes. Confusion followed. Speculation followed. Questions followed. But inside Jonathan's office, only one fact mattered. The truth had finally resurfaced. And after reading the document, the billionaire could no longer pretend it had never existed. The truth no longer belonged to the archive room. It was now sitting in the center of the most important board meeting Reed Capital had held in years. 2 days after Jonathan Reed halted the acquisition process, members of the board gathered inside the executive conference room overlooking downtown Chicago. The atmosphere felt nothing like previous meetings. The confidence that once surrounded the transaction had disappeared. Thick binders covered the polished table. Legal advisors occupied seats along the walls. Compliance officers stood quietly near presentation screens. Everyone knew something significant had changed. What few understood was how dramatically. Jonathan entered the room carrying a copy of the recovered memorandum along with Emily Carter's report. Conversations immediately stopped. The room grew quiet as he took his seat at the head of the table. Outside the glass walls, the city moved as usual. Inside, every person present sensed that the meeting would determine the future of the acquisition. The lead compliance officer began the presentation. Step by step, she walked the board through the timeline. The missing document, the forgotten archive section, the transfer records, the recovery process. Every claim was supported by evidence. Every conclusion pointed back to the same reality. A critical legal memorandum had disappeared from active review for 14 years. As the presentation continued, several board members exchanged uneasy glances. Others reviewed documents with growing concern. Then the memorandum appeared on the large screen. The room became even quieter. The legal language was displayed line by line. The warning was unmistakable. Years earlier, outside counsel had specifically cautioned against relying on assumptions now embedded throughout the current acquisition model. Nobody interrupted. Nobody challenged the wording. The document spoke for itself. One director slowly removed his glasses and reread the highlighted section. Another reviewed the transaction forecasts beside him. A third leaned back in silence. The deeper they examined the evidence, the more obvious the problem became. The acquisition had been built upon a foundation that was no longer reliable. A hush fell across the room. Jonathan remained still. He had already reviewed the findings multiple times, but seeing the evidence displayed before the board created a different impact. The reality became impossible to escape. Millions of dollars had been committed based on assumptions directly contradicted by a document hidden inside a forgotten archive box. The lead legal advisor eventually spoke. Her voice remained calm and professional. She explained that moving forward without fully addressing the memorandum would create substantial risk. Several directors nodded immediately. Others stared at the screen without speaking. For years, they had trusted the information placed before them. Now they were discovering that one missing file had altered the entire conversation. Then someone asked the question nobody expected. Who found this? The compliance officer opened Emily's report and answered simply. An archive records clerk named Emily Carter. For a moment, nobody spoke. The room went silent. Board members looked at one another as if expecting a different answer. Some had spent decades in corporate leadership. Others had managed billion-dollar transactions. Yet the person who uncovered the truth was neither an executive nor an attorney. She was a woman working quietly among shelves of forgotten records. Jonathan lowered his eyes toward the report resting before him. The silence lasted several seconds. Then he looked around the table and delivered the decision. The acquisition would remain suspended until every issue raised by the recovered document had been fully addressed. No one objected. No one argued. The evidence was simply too clear. And in that moment, the room finally understood that the most important voice in the company had come from the place they least expected. The document had changed the future of the company. What happened next changed the way people saw Emily Carter forever. In the weeks following the board meeting, Reed Capital conducted a comprehensive review of the acquisition. Legal teams revisited assumptions. Analysts rebuilt financial models. Outside advisors reevaluated years of conclusions. The deeper they examined the recovered memorandum, the clearer the truth became. Had the transaction moved forward without the missing document, the company could have committed itself to a decision based on incomplete information. The discovery did not create a crisis. Prevented one. Quietly, the narrative inside the company began to shift. Employees who had never heard Emily's name suddenly knew exactly who she was. Compliance officers spoke about the investigation with admiration. Attorneys referenced the archive recovery process as an example of diligence. Even senior executives found themselves discussing how a single records clerk uncovered what entire departments had overlooked. Through it all, Emily continued arriving at work each morning exactly as she always had. She organized files, reviewed records, updated inventories. She did not seek attention. She did not tell her story. She simply returned to her responsibilities. One afternoon, a message arrived requesting her presence in the company auditorium. Emily assumed it involved routine administrative matters. Instead, she found hundreds of employees gathered inside the large hall. The atmosphere felt unusually formal. Conversations filled the room as people took their seats. At the front stood Jonathan Reed beside a presentation screen displaying images from the company's history. Emily hesitated near the entrance, uncertain why she had been invited. Then Jonathan looked toward her and smiled. He motioned for her to join him on stage. A hush spread through the auditorium as Emily slowly walked forward. The same woman many people had passed in hallways without noticing now stood before the entire company. Jonathan waited until the room settled into silence. Then he began speaking. He described the acquisition review. He explained how a critical document disappeared years earlier. He outlined the investigation that eventually recovered it. Throughout the presentation, he never exaggerated the facts. He simply told the truth. Finally, he reached the most important part of the story. He explained how one employee refused to ignore an inconsistency everyone else overlooked. One employee followed the evidence instead of assumptions. One employee protected the company by doing her job with extraordinary care. Jonathan turned toward Emily. For a moment, Emotion appeared in his expression. Reed Capital employs thousands of talented people, he said. But sometimes the person who makes the greatest difference is the one nobody expects. The room went silent. Then the applause began. It started with a few employees. Then entire rows stood. Within seconds, hundreds of people were on their feet. The sound filled the auditorium. Emily looked across the crowd, overwhelmed by a recognition she never sought. Daniel Mercer stood among the employees applauding. So did executives from departments she had never visited. For the first time, people were not seeing her title. They were seeing her character. Jonathan handed her a framed recognition award, but the award itself was not what mattered. Respect mattered. Trust mattered. Being seen mattered. As the applause continued, Emily smiled softly and thanked everyone. Her words were brief. Her actions had already said everything necessary. Years earlier, a document had been hidden inside a forgotten archive room. The truth survived because it waited for someone willing to look. And on that day, an entire company remembered a lesson too often forgotten. Never underestimate the value of quiet diligence. Sometimes the person standing furthest from the spotlight is the one holding the truth.